Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Chekow-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. Welcome to the first review in our Fall Book Sandwiched In series. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and of course the thousands of people who attend each year. We are live streaming the formal portion of today's program to the library's YouTube channel at Rochester Public Library, New York. If you need access to the induction loop in the auditorium, please adjust your hearing aid to the T switch. FFRPL expands the library's impact. Our nonprofit organization raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. And here are a few recent examples. We raise funds through donations to an annual campaign, capital campaigns, grants, planned gifts, and revenue from book sales on site and online. If you are already on our mailing list, you should have received our fall campaign letter last week. The letters outline how FFRPL helps to support the library as it evolves and adjusts to meet the ever-changing needs of the community. If you don't get our printed mailings, you can read our fall campaign letter at ffrpl.org. We present programs like today's Book Sandwiched In Review. We support special projects and exhibits like the Art of the Book and Paper exhibit, now on view across the street in the Rundell building. The reception is next Wednesday, September 18th from 5:30 to 7, with a presentation and artist awards which begin at 6. FFRPL is a founding sponsor of the exhibit, and details are posted on the library's website. FFRPL also helps to create specialized spaces. Recently, FFRPL helped support the Maplewood branch's temporary move to the former Holy Rosary Church and Mary's Place on Lexington Avenue. You can learn more about Maplewood's 2-year renovation at rockcitylibrary.org. And finally, FFRPL purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the library, including the new chairs and tables we're all using today, a big improvement over what we had previously, agreed? Thanks to our many donors who make our work possible. Today, Gary Craig will review The Infernal Machine, a true story of dynamite, terror, and the rise of the modern detective by Stephen Johnson. The Infernal Machine is a historical account of several ideas: anarchy, the political movement that emerged in the mid-19th century, the political terrorism that furthered that vision in the United States, and the revolutionary idea of crime fighting as information science based on data instead of physical force. A model that originated in Paris and London and was at the core of the creation of the Identification Bureau of the New York Police Department, which of course has since evolved into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. Award-winning investigative journalist Gary Craig is a member of the DNC's Watchdog team. He focuses on public safety and criminal justice, and he has worked at Rochester newspapers since 1990. Please join me in welcoming Gary Craig to our podium.
Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Thanks, Joe, for the technical work back there. Appreciate it. And actually, let me just thanks the Friends and Foundation of Rochester Public Library. I appreciate the opportunity. So many of you out there I know. Thanks, Susan. Renee Manerick, who I think was the one who came up with the idea of me being here and then somehow decided Venice was a better place to be. Go figure. She can watch the video later. Just a quick bit about me. I've been here in Rochester since 1990, and I am now the last person at the DNC, and this will mean something to some of you, if not all of you, who previously worked full-time at the Times Union before the merger, as I think Dan Karen back there can attest from our many times at City Hall together. And so So the good part of that is, I guess I have some foundation of knowledge, both when we're talking about law enforcement here and other topics. The bad part of that is I tend to forget about half of it. So, as you'll see as we discuss here, the book, and again, I was unfamiliar with this book before I asked to review it, and as a person who writes nonfiction, writes of crime, writes of criminal justice, just a very quick nutshell, then we'll get into the details here, a little more detail. I found it both humbling, inspiring. I was envious of his research. I was envious of the way he was able to package it together. It's a marvelously written book, and if you heard, as Susan was describing, there are so many components of this book that to be able to shoehorn, yes, it's 300 some pages, but to be able to shoehorn it, it almost seemed as effortlessly as he does, and to keep this sort of streamlined narrative going, it is really a feat. And I'm actually looking forward to reading it a second time to kind of get a better handle on it than I did the first. So, I mean, for those of you who have read it, and then those who won't, we'll talk about it now. As was said, I mean, there's discussion, a lot of discussion about anarchy, the anarchist movement, et cetera, its origins, its nascent days, what it evolved to in the United States. Sadly, the way terror became part of, the tendency to try to change things in that, with the anarchist movement. Not all of them. We'll talk about that some. There's the talk of law enforcement in the book and sort of the seeds, the foundations of where we are today. We're not completely there, obviously, and we'll talk about that, but at least this sort of informational base to policing and what you can do with that. It's got, I mean, let's face it, it's got anarchy, it's got love, it's got crime, it's got violence. What more can you want in a book? It's got everything. And I have to admit, talk about forgetting, and perhaps I knew this at one time and I forgot. As I said, there are many things that fall into that category. Who here knew and remembered that Emma Goldman spent Rochester time? Okay, good. Okay, yes. I was not one of them. So, and I know I've read it before. Some of our great columnists have written about it. But that took me down a rabbit hole, we'll talk about later, about reading about Emma Goldman in Rochester. Just on the side of this, I just started visiting all kinds of sites. Another question for you here, because I want to start off talking a little about anarchy and what it is in this book and this story. So when we discuss anarchy and sort of your thoughts of anarchy now, when you hear the word anarchy, any thoughts of whether you have, this is good, this is bad, indifferent? I mean, what sort of comes to your mind? And chaos? Yes. Any other thoughts? Is that pretty much where everybody is? Political struggle, yeah. Any other thoughts? Then, yeah. Danger, yeah. And yes, exactly. And that's where, I mean, this book opens really with sort of the roots of anarchy in the U.S. And I think like a lot of political movements, you see that the origin of it, there wasn't this violent foundation at the origin. There wasn't that we're going to go out and use the Infernal Machine, dynamite, to try to get our way. It was rooted in, I might say they're basically sort of unlikely or utopian ideas, with this idea that you could have this community in which there was no sort of leadership hierarchy, sort of all worked for the betterment, the betterment of all. And it grew out of, a lot of what people were seeing in the working conditions in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and, to this day, there's still problems elsewhere. And if you go back, maybe not get into a high-minded talk about political systems, but I think if you go back to the early days of the sort of foundation, whether we're talking about communism, socialism, democracy, obviously, maybe not monarchies, that's a whole different thing. But you can see these foundations where there's kind of well-intentioned, and then some of them go off the rails, and violence or whatever becomes the means to try to reach this end. And actually, when I look at the title of the book, the one thing I did think was missing, but I fully understand why, is anarchy, because anarchy is so much a part of this book. And the title, obviously, A True Story of Dynamite, Terror, and the Rise of the Modern Detective, which is a lot more interesting than if you talk about the history of anarchy in your title. So I fully get why they would do that. As a person that comes from the newspaper industry now, we have what is known as SEO. Probably nobody knows what SEO is, right? Jennifer might, which is search engine optimization. That basically means you're trying to create headlines that Google will find, and then readers will find. So I understand how the title in a book is almost like SEO. You want to make sure people see the title and buy it. But when you see in this book is kind of this original version of anarchy, its sort of nascent days, and where it can go. And it's admittedly kind of a rosy-eyed vision, and we can argue or discuss Emma Goldman as one who carries that rosy-eyed vision, and that ultimately descends sadly into violence. What we're talking about, somebody talked about chaos, disruption, violence. Well, those weren't the original plans. And the people like Emma Goldman, and she experienced it firsthand, but she heard of it elsewhere, saw these workplace conditions that were just, especially now, I mean, if you've read, you've seen what it was like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, were just horrific. And the people were just pretty much pawns to the capitalist goal of somebody else making a lot of money. And they struggled, and they died, and they were injured. And this sort of became part of the foundation of the movement, because there was this belief that those who were at the top of the capitalist system, and we can still, we won't, but you can argue now about if we've moved from there or not, did not have the well-being of the worker at their heart and in their minds, and basically what were these people to do other than go and make a terrible living, but a living nonetheless every day. Hence the foundation of the anarchist movement. And they also saw, really, if we talk about Haymarket and some of the other kind of uprisings, et cetera, I mean, they also saw the people who were considered the chieftains of the communities, the Rockefellers, et cetera, willing to use their own violence to basically get their way. I mean, you saw the incident in the book, if you read it, where basically a tent city is torched to the ground and children die. And that was justified as they were pushing back against the system. These were people who were really trying to push back against what they were up against in the workplace. So then, this, as the book says, corresponds, sort of coincides with the rise, the birth of dynamite. I guess luckily for the anarchist movement, if you want to say, but not really. But it became a tool that which they used. And the history is full of ironies. Do people here, I don't know if you read the book or not, or if you know, who was the creator of dynamite? Exactly, and the same Nobel was, hence Peace Prize today. And if you go back, they discuss it briefly here, but he thought that we were almost going to have like this sort of nuclear-like stalemate that we talk about today, with dynamite. If everybody had dynamite, then nobody's going to blow each other up. Some people had different ideas. He also, and of course, he believed there was the whole workplace use of dynamite as well, which we know, quarries, et cetera. So there was that. So the bad news was that ultimately, sadly, as this book really attests to, his invention was used for a lot of violence, a lot of deaths, and a lot of injuries. I guess, for his family, it made them enough money that they could then create the prizes that carry his name, including the Peace Prize. So he was able to somewhat rectify that, but and it's not as if he thought that dynamite was going to become the damage doer that it did, but sadly it did. So there's one thing that we know about history, that every good history story, whatever its lineage, whatever its foundation, wherever it goes, wherever it started, has to have a Rochester connection. I mean, it just seems, no matter what we talk about, there seems to always be a Rochester connection. And that's why, again, having not remembered, I think I did know once about Emma Goldman's time in Rochester, because we've written about it, but as I said, it was one of those things that is going out of the sieve of my memory. This just fascinated me, and not only just the Rochester connection, but if you get to the book, and I'm admittedly going to bounce around here a bit, so my apologies there. I teach some, and my students will tell you that I eventually get back to the point, so travel with me here for a moment. But there's a lot of Western New York connections. I mean, just there's parts of this book, the history, that just are very central. It's interesting sort of reading now to kind of the history of Western New York. The McKinley assassination obviously is a big part of this book. It becomes, Emma Goldman, basically the man who killed McKinley, talks of being inspired by the writings of Emma Goldman. So just by that utterance, that writing, she becomes an accessory. She had nothing to do with it, but she inspired him to do it. And that was in Buffalo. I admit something else I've forgotten, because, or if I ever knew, the details of the McKinley assassination. It's not like the McKinley assassination takes as much space up on the library shelves as does the Lincoln stories. So, it's hard not to find out about Abraham Lincoln, but McKinley books are fewer and far between. But the fact that he lived for really nearly a week thereafter and appeared to be on the mend, but ultimately pre-penicillin, bacteria got him. And so the man who kills McKinley, as so often happens today, to use the term lone wolf, but inspired by a movement. And then, of course, there becomes a belief that he was part of a grander conspiracy, or was he not? And that becomes a whole subject, as we can see with almost every attempter today. Which reminds me, one quick thing while talking about that. Page 114, I got it marked here. I thought this was really interesting. When they talk about Leon Solgaz, the man who killed McKinley, so, it is not exactly clear why he, with his right hand obstinately stuck in his coat pocket, did not attract the attention of the Secret Service men protecting the president. One account has it, then it goes on. I said, wow, that sounds kind of familiar. Just, different, but still the same sort of issues that arise today. He is now, I know I'm really getting deep in the weeds here, but this is because these are issues that resonate with me because I write about them. Does anybody remember where he was executed? Solgaz? He was actually executed in Auburn, which I did not know was the home of the first electric chair. That was something else, it's central New York, western, whatever you call it. And we talked about ironies. The irony there, is anybody familiar with the history of Auburn and prisons? So Auburn is actually, if you go back to the sort of the history of corrections and all, Auburn is actually, the birthplace might be stretching it, but it's a very important part of a move towards a more rehabilitative system with prisons. I mean, a lot of that was born out of the work of churchgoers and churches in that region who tried to turn prison, it wasn't, you can't completely remove the punitive part because you're in prison, but they tried to build a structure that was much more rehabilitative. And it became the foundation, we've cycled back and forth, that's a whole other topic, whole other day, we cycled back and forth to that time and time again. But so again, to me, there was this irony when I saw that Auburn was the home of the electric chair, and I know Auburn was also the home, and the time frame wasn't really, we're maybe a couple of decades apart, the home of where people tried to build more humane and more positive prisons. That's, again, talking about Western New York and Rochester. I do want to just, because I can't get away from Emma Goldman and Rochester quite yet. So, this truly did send me into her writings. Was it Control F you hit to search? Is that what it is? So, yes. And I had her writings, and I was just doing Control F for Rochester, and just finding everything she'd ever written about Rochester. And as you see in the book, it's, when he calls it the backwaters of upstate New York, that stung a little. And when you read her writings, she doesn't, she doesn't say much different. She pretty much talks about dreary, bleak, parochial. Some of her writings made me think of the label that came later. Some of you may remember Smugtown. That was the term that came later. And some of her writings in kind of a parochial sort of sense of the community made me think of Smugtown in that label. Now, in the defense of Rochester, okay, I'm a transplant, but I love the city and the region, so I have to defend ourselves against the descriptions here and in the writings of Emma Goldman. She did move here in January, so there is that. And she was a teenager, moved here in January. She wrote on this, "We had heard that Rochester was the flower city of New York, but we arrived there on a bleak and cold January morning." So, and you can kind of understand. Having moved here in the winter myself, I fully get that. It did seem a little bleak at first. And the discussion continued both in the book and in the subsequent stuff I read about her. There were some really funny moments just reading her talks of Rochester. When she first and I'm really getting in the weeds here and off track, but I'll come back, I promise. One of her early meetings with Alexander Berkman, I can't remember if it was in Chicago or Manhattan, my apologies, but she talks to him of being from Rochester. And his response, this is from her writings, she goes, "Yes, I know the city." He goes, "I'm sorry, yes, I know the city. It has good beer." So we did have a reputation, apparently, in the early 1900s. And if you've been to the Genesee Brewery, you see where you can sort of look at the map and hit the different decades. It shows how many breweries are here. There were a ton of breweries at that time. So you have to, I think, when you look at kind of what she saw here, she was young, very incredibly brilliant woman. She was working as a seamstress, obviously seeing the working conditions there. And she had been reading of the anarchist movement, and you could sort of see how this became appealing to her in some ways, especially. And she was new. She was in a community that was sort of isolated to a degree, and so you can kind of get a sense of why she. And again, this is not to sort of downplay the political underpinnings of her belief, because they were real, they were legitimate. But you can also sort of see how the seeds of this happened. And she was young, and this is a real stretch, but I'm going to come back. So I heard a story this weekend that has nothing to do with this book, but that I just found it funny, because talk about youth and the desire of youth to perhaps find something different than what their community is preaching them, or what their family is preaching them, or what this sort of rebellious spirit that we have when we're young, and we sometimes wish we could harness it and channel it later in life. Some friends of my oldest daughter, who's Jennifer knows, good to see you, who's they are very aligned with the Buffalo Bills, and of course you can't go to a talk about anything, but somehow finding a way to root to the Buffalo Bills, and so. My daughter's friend from college has children of her own, and my daughter's friend's family is, as I said, tied to the Buffalo Bills. Well, one of the children of his family has just decided that he's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. That's just, he just said, this is it, I'm done. The kid's not even a teenager yet, but just the spirit, I'm going to break free of this, the restraints that you put on me. I don't know, maybe there is something similar between Kansas City Chiefs and anarchy, but okay, that goes to show you how when you're young, you're just going to try to break every tie with a home. So what we see in sort of coming back away from the Rochester stuff, obviously, and this is, and I think, to me, another really powerful part, really good part, solid part of this book, is there are so many characters in this book, and some of them admittedly flit through, and you sort of come back and but there are key characters, both later in the book in the law enforcement side and throughout, Emma Goldman, who just are so well fleshed out, and there's so much you learn about them, so much that makes me want to learn more. And then obviously you get this whole intersection with violence. You start off with this movement that you can argue that perhaps there is this well-intentioned foundation to it and this logic to it, and ultimately it doesn't find itself making the headway, whether it's against the corporate structure, whether it's against the political structure, and it resorts to violence. It resorts to dynamite. It resorts, the Infernal Machine, as the title says. It sadly blowing up people right and left. Of course, there are all these incredible stories in here when it failed too, which it's almost like you're on the edge of your seat. Is it going to happen this time or not? Is the dynamite going to work or not? And it sort of takes us to that bigger picture, that question that I don't know if we'll ever escape from. When is violence justified? And I'm getting sort of way off track here, but I mean, that is a big part of this book, of this story. Their belief that the violence is justified. I mean, if you research the IRA and, and the British issue, the whole thing there. I mean, we have more, obviously, recent examples of people justifying violence on both sides. And as we know, violence begets violence. But that is just the very core, I think, of this book and this story as it goes on. And it's interesting, Emma Goldman's approach to it is, it's not ambivalence, because that would be a very weak word to use to strike, but there's never this, early on it appears that early in her life, she's not embracing it. As she gets older and some of her friends have embraced it, and she's stayed in touch with them even when they're in prison, and she does her own prison stint. It's not that she sort of comes out with this full-throated, wholehearted, yes, violence is right, but she never quite says no in those later days. She sort of gives these responses that you have to kind of try to read between the lines. And there was a part here, where did I put it? This part, wait a minute, one second. This part of the book really appealed to me. I mean, I found this book, for one, as a reporter, the history of journalism, the history of reportage and all. Nellie Bly a famous character, a famous female reporter. At the time, there were not many female reporters. If I were to guess, and I haven't gone back and read about this interview, she did stories on workplace conditions. She did stories on what it was like, what they were then called the insane asylums. And I almost wonder if there was a kind of simpatico, sort of foundation to her beliefs as to what she saw, separate from the violence. But there's this part. I mean, Nellie Bly, if you study the history of women in journalism, she's right up there with Ida B. Wells. More recently, probably Helen Thomas. The Gwen Eiffels, just a character of historic stature in my mind. And so there's this scene where she goes to prison when Emma Goldman is in prison to interview her, and I just want to read a bit here because there's no way I can describe it. But the intro to this, which they say, that she begins by parroting the language of the tabloid press. Quote, "You have read of her as a property-destroying, capitalist-killing, riot-promoting agitator. You see her," and this is obviously her writing of Emma. "You see her in your mind, a great raw-boned creature with short hair and bloomers, a red flag in one hand, a burning torch in the other, both feet constantly off the ground, and murder continually upon her lips." And that was the image that had been painted by the press largely. That was the Emma Goldman that the world sort of knew. And then she goes on to, Goldman is a little bit of a girl, just 5 feet high, not showing her 120 pounds, with a saucy turned-up nose and very expressive blue-gray eyes that gazed inquiringly at me through shell-rimmed glasses. You don't see that kind of description anymore, but I just loved it. I don't know why. And so at one point, she finally asked, "Do you think murder is going to help your cause?" And she says that Goldman contemplates the question for a few seconds and then replied, "This is a long subject to discuss. I don't believe that through murder we shall gain, but by war, labor against capital, masses against classes, which will not come in 20 or 25 years, but someday I firmly believe we shall gain. Until then, I am satisfied to agitate, to teach, and I only ask justice and freedom." And as the author notes, the ambiguity expressed in the statement, "I do not believe in murder, but I do believe in war," would become a constant refrain over the course of her future as a public figure. And there is that. I mean, what does that mean? I don't believe in murder, but war? Okay, I'm fine with that. I mean, I guess you could say there's a distinction. There's a distinction without difference, probably so, but it clearly was in her mind. And that is to me, a part of this book is that whole sort of tug and pull of violence, whether it's worthwhile to get your means. So jumping ahead, because I want to move off from Goldman, because again, I could spend a lot more time talking about her, but there's other parts of the book. But I cannot leave without talking about her response to J. Edgar Hoover. I don't know if people remember this, when she's getting on the boat to be deported. Actually, they're on the boat together. And it's a young J. Edgar Hoover, and in this book, we see the seeds of what he will become. He's brilliant in many ways. It's sort of this way through research, through basically not just the old-fashioned physical policing, but through some sort of research, it's hard. I mean, now we think of things sort of categorizing things is something we do all the time, especially when we have a computer. But they used to not really cross-reference much when you go to the beginning of this book in these early days with police work. If you were a suspect in one crime and you'd committed another crime a mile away, there didn't seem to be in the late 1800s any system that was going to identify you as the likely person in one crime. And Hoover and some before him really became masterful and all, and he sort of worked his way up through what ultimately became the FBI and the head of the FBI. So he is discussing with Emma Goldman as she's on the boat to be deported later in life to Russia, how he's treated her, et cetera, how law enforcement, and he says, "Haven't I given you a square deal, Miss Goldman?" He asks, they're in Brooklyn, and she responds, "Oh, I suppose you've given me as square a deal as you could. We shouldn't expect from any person something beyond his capacity." And I was like, oh. And I was so struck by that line that I had to find out if it was real. I couldn't, and this is the reporter part of me. Okay, what was the source? Did she put this in her writings? If so, it doesn't mean it isn't true, but when you're writing about yourself, sometimes you tend to make myself sound a little better than I really did at that moment in time. But sure enough, I found it was actually a congressman who was on the boat and overheard her response and was so struck by its brilliance and its pithiness that he had to write it down. So of all the things I read in the book, I don't know if it's not a book you laugh at when you're reading it, but that one I have to admit, I got a chuckle when I read that. And especially because I think we know what J. Edgar Hoover became. And you kind of see, again, the foundation of it here. You see the law enforcement side and the sort of the steady policing side, but you also see this willingness to kind of subvert the system, the criminal justice system, the political system, as what he believes, is whatever the means to reach the end that he believes is necessary and right and just. And obviously we see this later in life. Obviously we see it later in life with J. Edgar Hoover and the surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. We see it later in life with his belief that every protest is pretty much a subversion effort by the communists. And so here it's a young J. Edgar Hoover, but you see that as well. And as we discussed, the law enforcement part of the book, and what again I liked about it was, these issues are different, and I'm perhaps not weaving them together as he did, but they are woven together in a way that, even though dissimilar and distinct, I think the narrative never drops because of that. The narrative just flows, and it's seamless. And even when he's jumping from the history of anarchy to the characters to the change in law enforcement, and a lot of that becomes because of how do you respond to the bombings that are going on. And we start to see this, whether it's undercover operations, which were particularly dangerous, whether it's the growth of some of the modern surveillance, for better or for worse, that we see. Wiretapping, begins. You see the use of fingerprinting, you see, and again, this classification system, Bertillon system, that came from Europe, in which this was an early system in which, if they had a criminal suspect, he or she, they basically kept track of the physical characteristics, really, and down to real detail. And in a way, that became this crime-fighting tool. And then they categorized it and cross-referenced in a way that was much easier to find people. And it just seems like kind of a no-brainer. But it really, until you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, it really was not being used. I'm getting close. Okay. There's one part I wanted to read, but I've got to. Well, I won't. I'll just paraphrase it. When we're talking about the date, imagine. Anybody seen The Hurt Locker, the movie? Okay, so the danger now of diffusing bombs with the knowledge we have, with the technological sort of capacity we have for these people to know what, the people that are taking on this task to know what they're doing. Imagine being somebody then whose task was to find this bomb, usually a dynamite-laden explosive, and defuse it and find a way. And there's a part of the book where they talk about the fellow who headed this, I forgot the exact title, the bomb squad. But one of the rules he had for his folks, and pretty much all men then, was don't smoke around the bombs, the dynamite, and don't take it on mass transit when you're carrying it away. I was like, okay, those sounds like logical thoughts. And you see all these sort of seeds of law enforcement and where we are today. And you see this, just like I'm talking about these sort of the questions of violence. The questions that arise here with policing, I don't know if we're ever going to get rid of them. There's always going to be this physical aspect of policing, that they talk about here, how before the rise of the new sort of more sophisticated detective, et cetera, people just go out and beat people up. That was the way it was done, whether you had the right person or not. There's still, I know a lot of police, and I write a lot about policing. There's obviously going to be this element to a police force of these folks who really like to chase people. And they really like to physically catch people, And I don't know, we keep working to build this sort of professionalism and all. I don't know if you ever quite extract that from policing. And just one quick story. I'm in court one time. There's a woman who's a local criminal defense lawyer, and she and I are together, and we're watching a trial. This is a woman who I know has eviscerated police on the stand. She has looked at their records, she's dissected them, and there's an officer on the stand, I won't name him, but he's looks like a bodybuilder, really built guy, and he has a history of complaints against him. And I know the attorney whom I'm sitting next to has been one of the people that have asked, that has asked him about those complaints when she's cross-examined. And she looks at me and goes, if I was being attacked, I'd kind of like him to be the guy coming to my assistance. You kind of see that. I don't know how there is that element of policing. I don't know how you ever quite get away from that. Maybe one day we will. How are we doing time? Okay. So because I want to get, if people have questions, I'll make sure I give you a chance. And I know some people have to leave early. It won't hurt my feelings, don't worry. So I want to just, the book jacket here, I went back to it after reading it, and I thought that something is said at the end of the book jacket is interesting. And it says, "The Infernal Machine is the complex prehistory of our current moment, when decentralized anarchist networks have once again taken to the streets to protest law enforcement abuses. Right-wing militia groups have attacked government buildings, and surveillance is almost ubiquitous." And I can tell you, we who I don't want to put myself in the class for this guy, but we who write of past history, we're always trying to bring it to the present because it makes it more relevant. It does. If you can make these ties, and sometimes I think we may force it just to try to pretend there's a connection there when there's really not. And oftentimes, book jackets take things to the nth degree with that stuff. But I think what he says here, I don't know who wrote the book jacket, but the book jacket, the blurb itself, is right on point when you think about it, because the very same issues that we're talking about, I mean, who knows if Antifa really exists? I mean, I don't think you're going to go find, oh, where's the Antifa meeting tonight? But there is this kind of, some people argue there's this anarchist spirit to some of the movements that we've seen protests with. But at the same time, I think I would argue that those protests that we saw a few years ago in the aftermath of George Floyd, in the aftermath of Daniel Prude, they weren't trying to totally upend the system. They weren't trying to be anarchists who were, let's scrap the government. They were trying to improve the policing and some of what we talk about here. Make sure that people aren't dying at the hands of the police. We jump ahead, and obviously it's what he's talking about here, to January 6th. Is that anarchy if you try to disrupt what was, I believe, an accurate the election? The person won who won the election. If you differ with me, we don't need to talk about it here. but I will, I'll pretty much believe that. And so January 6th, you have this assault on the Capitol. Is that anarchy to try to upend the government because you don't believe the election results, or you do believe them, but you're not content with the outcome? And fingers crossed that if, depending on what happens, we see nothing like that again. And then you come to the issue of policing, and just as I said, that these issues have not gone away. Policing is always sort of adding these elements of sophistication, and sometimes we find out what we believe to be sophisticated, what we believe to be accurate is really not. There's a lot of scientific things I won't get into that years later we determined they're really not as reliable as we once thought they are. There's a lot of policing that years later we learn, whether it's identification. We used to think, hey, I could walk out of this room and describe the person sitting right up front there. We have a hard time identifying 10 minutes later somebody sitting, who obviously robbed me or whatever. There's so much policing that we're constantly learning anew about. And that's where I think you see the beginning of the evolution of this book, not away from the physical component of policing, but at least this adaptation of a method that is probably more reliable, that's less physical, less brutal, but obviously we still have a ways to go on that front. That all said, I want to make sure I have some time for questions. Now we're getting closer. Anybody has anything? I highly recommend the book. That's my review in a nutshell. But does anybody have anything? I know we're tight. Yes. Oh, we can do this. So everybody has their numbers? Okay, yeah. What are your names? Reverend James Swartz.